The Saga of Ragnar Lothbrok. Chapter 1. Whispers of the North. In the far reaches of the north, where the seas are restless and the skies often heavy with mist, stories not written upon parchment, but carried upon the breath of the wind. These are lands where the mountains stand like guardians, where fjords cut deep into the earth, and where the people endure long winters by firelight, telling tales that blur the line between truth and legend. It is here, in the cold silence of Scandinavia, that whispers of a man named Ragnar Lothbrok first arise. His name, spoken softly among farmers and warriors alike, traveled across icy waters and stormy coasts. Some called him a king, others a raider, still others a trickster blessed by the gods. To some, he was a mere man. To others, he was a child of Odin himself, walking the earth for a brief time before returning to Valhalla. What is certain is not whether Ragnar existed exactly as the sagas tell us, but that he lived in memory, stronger, perhaps, than any flesh and blood man could have. For the people of the North, memory was as powerful as life itself. A story told enough times became a truth that no sword could cut, no fire could burn away. The sagas say that Ragnar was a man unlike others, born not of comfort, but of struggle. They say that he rose from humble beginnings, not as a king's son, but as a boy who listened to the howl of the wind and the crashing of the waves, who believed the gods whispered to him in dreams. Some imagined him as a boy with bright, piercing eyes that seemed to see further than the horizon. Even in youth, the stories tell us, Ragnar was restless. He could not be content with fishing nets or the tending of sheep. His gaze often wandered toward the sea, where the horizon promised more than the earth beneath his feet could ever give. He was drawn to the mystery of distant lands, to the thought of monasteries filled with treasure, to the clash of shields, and to the eternal glory promised in the halls of Valhalla. But the North does not raise dreamers without trials. Ragnar's world was one of hardship, long winters when food was scarce, storms that swallowed boats whole, rival clans that fought with axes and fire. To survive, one needed more than strength of arm. One needed cunning, patience, and the ability to bend fate without breaking it. And in the boy who would one day be called Lothbrok, there was all of this and more. The storytellers say that even as a boy, Ragnar would speak of his destiny. Around the hearth fire, while embers glowed and the wind rattled the doors, he would say that his name would one day echo beyond the fjords, across the seas, into the very hearts of kings. The old ones would shake their heads, smiling at the arrogance of youth, but in their hearts they wondered, could this boy truly be chosen by the gods? As the years passed, the whispers grew louder. In one version, he was destined by Odin himself. In another, his path was forged by his own will and restless ambition. And so, the boy from the fjords stepped into legend, not all at once, but slowly, each step carrying him closer to a fate both glorious and terrible. Thus begins the Saga of Ragnar Lothbrok, a tale not only of raids and battles, of love, of loss, of faith, and of fire. A story where myth and history intertwine like the branches of Yggdrasil, eternal and inseparable. Long before the world knew his name, Ragnar was a boy wandering the valleys and ridges of the fjords. His home was a place of endless contrasts. Summers of green fields and wildflowers swaying in the breeze, and winters of deep silence, when snow lay heavy upon the earth and daylight dwindled to only a few fragile hours. It was here that Ragnar grew, surrounded not by kings or courts, but by the rhythms of farming life. His family tended sheep and cattle, their hands rough from work, their eyes hardened by the demands of the land. Yet, even among these rugged people, Ragnar stood apart. From an early age, he asked questions few others dared. Why must we remain in the same valley when the world is so vast? He would ask. Elders answered with the wisdom of caution. The sea was dangerous, filled with storms and monsters. Distant lands were hostile and unknown. But Ragnar did not fear storms. To him, the roar of thunder and the crash of waves were not warnings. They were invitations. His mother would sometimes find him sitting for hours upon a rock overlooking the sea, staring into the distance as if expecting some secret to be revealed. When asked what he saw, Ragnar would smile faintly and say, "The future." Stories of gods and heroes filled his mind. In the evenings, when fires burned and families gathered to tell tales, Ragnar listened with wide eyes. He heard of Odin, who sacrificed his own eye for wisdom. He heard of Thor, who carried his hammer against giants. And he heard of Loki, cunning and unpredictable, who could twist fate with his cleverness. Ragnar admired Thor's strength and Odin's wisdom, but it was Loki's cleverness that fascinated him most. For Ragnar, battles were not won only with axes, they were won with the mind. The village noticed his daring spirit. As a boy, he climbed cliffs others feared, swam in waters that seemed too cold to bear, and ran faster than boys older and stronger. He was not the largest, but he was quick, agile, and clever. His eyes, always searching, seemed to look past what others saw. One story tells of Ragnar facing down a wolf that had wandered too close to the herds. Armed only with a spear too long for his arms and courage too great for his years, he stood his ground. The beast snarled, its yellow eyes fixed upon him. Yet Ragnar did not flee. With one sharp thrust, he drove the spear true, and the wolf fell. The villagers marveled, whispering that Odin himself had guided the boy's hand. But Ragnar's restlessness grew. The fjords, though beautiful, felt like a cage. Beyond the mountains lay kingdoms, cities, treasures, and adventures. He longed for ships that could cut across the waves, for the thrill of discovery, for the song of the sword against the shield. In dreams, he imagined himself leading men, sails billowing in the wind, his name carried by the cries of ravens. And when he awoke, he believed those dreams were not illusions, but promises. The boy from the fjords was becoming something more. Not yet a king, not yet a legend, but a spark. And sparks, when fed by wind and fate, become fire. Chapter 3. The Tale of Hairy Breeches. Among the many tales told of Ragnar Lothbrok, one stands apart for its strange and almost playful nature. It is the tale of how he earned his unusual name, Lothbrok, which means hairy breeches. The story begins with a challenge. Far from Ragnar's home, a kingdom lived in fear of a monstrous beast. Some call it a serpent, others a dragon, its scales gleaming like iron, its breath said to poison the air. Each year, the creature demanded tribute, and the people lived in despair. Ragnar, still a young man then, heard of this terror and saw in it an opportunity, not only for glory, but for destiny. He resolved to slay the beast. But how could a man face such a creature without being burned alive by its venom or fire? Here, Ragnar's cleverness revealed itself. He took a pair of trousers, simple, worn garments, and covered them in tar. Then he rolled them in sand and dipped them in boiling pitch, layer after layer, until they became heavy and rough, like armor made of stone. When he wore them, they itched and scratched, but they protected him. Thus he earned his strange name, Lothbrok, the man of hairy breeches. With spear in hand and his curious armor upon him, Ragnar faced the beast. The sagas say he fought bravely, striking blow after blow until the creature fell, its body crashing to the ground like a collapsing tower. Whether dragon or serpent or some other foe, the tale is less about the beast itself and more about Ragnar's spirit. He did not rush in blindly, relying only on strength. Instead, he used wit, preparation, and courage. The people rejoiced, hailing him as a hero. Songs were sung of the young warrior with the hairy breeches who had slain the terror that plagued them. From that day forward, his name carried not only the weight of his deeds, but also the mark of his cleverness. It is a strange name, perhaps even humorous, but in the North, names carried power. Lothbrok became a symbol, a man who could outthink as well outfight, who could turn the simplest of garments into the key to survival. And so, Ragnar Lothbrok, once a restless boy from the fjords, began to step firmly into legend. The dragon slayer, the cunning warrior, the man who bore the strangest of names with pride. Chapter 4: The Shield Maiden Lagertha. Among the many figures whose paths crossed with Ragnar's, none shines brighter in legend than Lagertha, the Shield Maiden. The sagas describe her as a woman of rare courage, standing tall among warriors, her long hair flowing like a banner, her shield held firm, her spear swift as lightning. She was no gentle maiden kept behind walls. She was the storm itself. The story tells that Ragnar first met her in battle. A Jarl's hall had been attacked, and Ragnar, arriving to help, saw among the defenders a woman fighting with the ferocity of 10 men. Her shield deflected sword after sword, and when her enemies thought her beaten, she rose again, striking true. Ragnar, who had seen warriors of every kind, found his heart not only by her beauty, but by her indomitable spirit. In the days that followed, Ragnar sought her out. He came not as a conqueror, but as a man entranced. Yet winning Lagertha's heart was no easy task. She was proud, wary of men who would see her as little more than a prize. Ragnar proved himself not by words alone, but by persistence, courage, and respect. When wolves were set upon him to test his resolve, he fought them off bare-handed. When her kin doubted his worth, he stood unbowed. At last, Lagertha accepted him. Their bond was forged not of convenience, but of fire. Two spirits, wild and unyielding, drawn together by fate. For a time, they lived as man and wife, raising children and sharing in the simple joys of hearth and home. But even in peace, Ragnar's restlessness stirred. He was not meant to linger too long in one place. The sea called, and with it the promise of raids, riches, and renown. Lagertha, though fierce, was bound also to her own path. The sagas differ on how their union ended. Some say Ragnar abandoned her, others at fate pulled them apart. Yet all agree on one thing. Lagertha left an indelible mark upon Ragnar's story. In Lagertha, Ragnar found not only love, but an equal. And in the telling of their tale, she remains forever a queen in her own right, a warrior whose name is remembered alongside his, both in saga and in song. Chapter 5. First Raids and Rising Fame, with a deep, steady voice and a sense of mystery. Speak slowly and clearly, adding subtle pauses for dramatic effect. The style should feel like an ancient legend being told by the fireside. Chapter 5. First Raids and Rising Fame. Ragnar's destiny was not to remain among fields and hearths. His heart beat to the rhythm of oars striking water, of sails snapping in the wind, of shields clashing upon foreign shores. And so he gathered men, farmers who longed for more than toil, warriors eager for plunder, and dreamers who, like him, saw in the sea the promise of glory. Their ships were long and sleek, carved with dragon heads at the prow, built for both river and ocean. The sight of them alone was enough to strike fear in villages unprepared for the storm. When Ragnar's fleet first cut through the waves, the world beyond Scandinavia began to tremble. The earliest raids were swift and brutal. Monasteries along the coasts of England and Francia, places filled with gold, silver, and holy relics, were easy prey. Monks, untrained in war, could do little against men hardened by cold seas and harsher lives. Ragnar's warriors plundered with the efficiency of wolves upon lambs. Yet what set Ragnar apart was not only his ferocity, but his vision. Where others saw only treasure, he saw opportunity. He sought to learn from the lands he raided, to understand their strengths and weaknesses, their kings and customs. His mind was as sharp as his axe, and his curiosity carried him further than mere greed. Stories of Ragnar spread quickly. In England, priests whispered of a fearsome pagan who descended upon holy ground with unrelenting force. In Francia, nobles warned of dragon-prowed ships that came like ghosts upon the tide. In the north, his fame grew. He was no longer just Ragnar Lothbrok. He was a leader, a figure whose name stirred both dread and admiration. But with fame came envy. Rival jarls watched his rise with unease. Some saw him as a threat to their power, others as a rival to their glory. Even among his followers, there were those who wondered if his destiny belonged only to him, or if it might consume them all. Still, Ragnar pressed forward, his gaze fixed always on the horizon. For him, the raids were not an end, but a beginning, a first step upon a path that stretched into legend. He had tasted the sea, felt the thrill of victory, and he knew there could be no turning back. The boy from the fjords had become a raider. The raider was becoming a leader, and soon the leader would become something more, a name whispered in fear and awe across the world, carried by the wings of ravens. Chapter 6: Sons of the Raven. As Ragnar's fame grew, so too did his household. Where once he was known only as a restless boy and then as a daring warrior, he now became a father, a role as weighty as any crown. His children, born of different unions, would themselves carry destinies that echoed through the ages. From Lagertha he had sons and daughters, though their names drift through the sagas like shadows, half remembered, half lost. Yet after their paths parted, Ragnar wed Aslog, the daughter of Sigurd the Dragon Slayer and Brynhild the Shield Maiden. In Aslog, Ragnar found not only beauty, but lineage heavy with legend. She carried within her the blood of heroes and gods, and from their union sprang sons whose deeds would carve their own sagas into history. There was Ivar the Boneless, a boy cursed by frailty, yet blessed with brilliance. Though his legs were weak, his mind was a sharpened blade, capable of cutting through schemes and strategies that confounded even the wisest of men. His gaze was piercing, and many said he could bend fate itself with his will. There was Bjorn Ironside, strong and steadfast, whose body seemed impervious to blades. Fearless in battle, he carried the spirit of a conqueror and would one day sail farther than even Ragnar dreamed, reaching the warm shores of the Mediterranean. There was Hvitserk, bold and daring, a warrior whose courage was matched only by his recklessness. He fought with a fire that made him both dangerous and unpredictable. And there was Sigurd Snake in the Eye, marked by a strange serpent-shaped pattern in his eye, a reminder of his mother's heroic bloodline. He was proud, sharp, and ambitious, destined for a place among kings. These sons were not merely children, they were the seeds of empire, each carrying a fragment of Ragnar's restless spirit. Around the hearth, Aslog told them tales of their ancestors, of Sigurd, who slew the dragon Fafnir, and of Brynhild, who walked through fire. Her words filled their imaginations, shaping them into men who would see themselves not as mere mortals, but as heirs to legend. Ragnar, for his part, loved them as fiercely as he led his men. Yet he was no simple farmer raising boys by the plow. His love came through the lessons of battle and hardship. He taught them to wield the axe, to command men, to read the skies and the seas. His sons grew not in safety, but in the crucible of his restless ambition. And so the world watched as a new generation arose. A father who dreamed of horizons had given life to sons who would one day surpass even his wildest ventures. In them, Ragnar's story would never end. For long after his voice fell silent, the voices of his sons would thunder across kingdoms, carried by the wings of ravens. Chapter 7: Prophecies and Dreams. With greatness comes the shadow of destiny, and for Ragnar, dreams were never mere illusions of sleep. They were whispers of what might be. The sagas speak often of the visions that haunted him, half blessing, half curse. One dream told of a great tree rising from his farmstead, its branches stretching to the heavens, its roots sinking deep into the earth. From its trunk flew ravens, dark and restless, scattering across the world. Seers who heard this dream nodded gravely. The tree was Ragnar, the ravens his sons, and their flight foretold the spread of his bloodline across distant lands. But trees, they warned, are also fated to fall. Another time, Ragnar dreamed of being ensnared in a net, powerless as serpents closed around him. He awoke in sweat, troubled but silent, for he knew dreams often spoke truths more dangerous than any sword. The Volvas, the seeresses of the north, whispered their own prophecies. They told Ragnar that his sons would grow to be greater than he, that his name would endure, but that his death would be cruel and without honor. Some warned of snakes, others of betrayal, others of a journey from which he would not return. Yet Ragnar was no man to flee from fate. He believed, as many of his people did, that destiny was woven by the Norns, the weavers of fate, and that no man could escape the thread laid before him. To Ragnar, the only choice lay not in avoiding death, but in meeting it with courage. Still, these visions weighed upon him. In quiet moments, when the sea was calm and his men slept, he would stare into the night sky, wondering how much of his life was his own, and how much was guided by unseen hands. Did he carve his own legend, or was he merely an actor in a play written long before his birth? Such thoughts did not stop him from seeking glory. If anything, they urged him on. For if death was inevitable, then he would live all the more fiercely, ensuring that when his thread was cut, the world would never forget his name. And so, Ragnar lived between two worlds, the tangible one of steel and blood, and the shadowed one of dreams and prophecy. Both shaped him, both drove him, and together they pushed him ever closer to the fate that awaited, the fate of Ragnar Lothbrok, legend of the North. Of all the raids that carried Ragnar's name across the seas, none shone brighter in memory than the great assault on Paris. Francia was not a land of small villages and quiet monasteries. It was a kingdom, rich, vast, and proud. To raid Paris itself was to strike at the very heart of power, to challenge kings and crowns, to carve one's name into history. Ragnar prepared his fleet with care. Longships, sleek as serpents, lined the shores, their dragon-headed prows painted with fresh colors, their sails woven bright with red and black. Warriors gathered, eager for the glory promised by such a daring venture. Farmers left their plows, young men sharpened axes, and old veterans strapped on their shields once more. The call of Ragnar Lothbrok was not easily ignored. The journey was long, rivers winding like veins into the body of Francia. Yet the Norsemen pressed on, their oars beating time against the water, their songs echoing under the sky. As they neared Paris, the sight was staggering. Tall walls of stone, towers crowned with banners, a city teeming with life. Few among Magnar's men had ever seen such a place. The siege began with fire and fury. The Northmen hurled themselves against the gates, battering with axes and hammers, while ladders clattered against the walls. Arrows rained down, but still they climbed, their shields raised like scales of a dragon. The air filled with the clash of steel, the cries of the wounded, and the roar of men hungry for conquest. Yet Paris was not so easily broken. The defenders fought with courage, pouring boiling oil upon the invaders, pushing back ladders, striking from above. Days stretched into weeks, the siege grinding on, both sides refusing to yield. It was here that Ragnar's cunning shone brightest. Realizing brute strength could not alone bring the city to its knees, he turned to strategy. Some tales speak of him using dead animals catapulted into the city to spread plague. Others tell of his men carrying boats across land to surprise the defenders from an unexpected quarter. Whatever the truth, it is certain that Ragnar's name filled the Franks with dread. At last, whether by fear, by famine, or by sheer exhaustion, Paris agreed to pay tribute. Gold and silver poured into Ragnar's coffers, wealth beyond the dreams of most men. The city had not fallen, but it had bent, and in bending, it had given Ragnar what he desired most, not only treasure, but renown. For in the halls of Francia, the nobles whispered, "Who was this Northman bold enough to strike at their greatest city?" And in the north, men spoke with awe of Ragnar Lothbrok, the raider who had dared where none before him had. The siege of Paris was not just a raid, it was a declaration. Ragnar was no longer merely a Viking chief. He was a force the world could not ignore. Chapter 9: Storm over England. If Francia had shown Ragnar the riches of the south, England offered him something different: rivalry, resistance, and destiny. The green fields and winding rivers of that land became the stage upon which much of his legend unfolded. England was divided then, a patchwork of kingdoms: Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, East Anglia, each ruled by kings who often quarreled as much with one another as with foreign invaders. To Ragnar, this disunity was an invitation. Where one kingdom might falter, another might rise, but none could stand united against the storm he carried across the sea. Ragnar's first raids upon English shores were swift and devastating. Villages burned, monasteries were plundered, and coastal defenses crumbled under the axes of the Northmen. The stories of his coming spread like wildfire, and soon his very name was enough to chill the hearts of those who prayed in the churches of the land. But England was no passive victim. Its kings began to resist. Armies gathered, shields locked, swords raised. On more than one occasion, Ragnar's men faced fierce battles where blood turned fields into rivers of red. Yet even in the face of opposition, Ragnar thrived. For him, battle was not only survival, it was the song of life itself, the proving ground of destiny. One tale speaks of Ragnar capturing a great English city, only to release it once tribute was paid. Another tells of his clever use of rivers, sailing deep inland where no one thought ships could go, striking at the heart of kingdoms before slipping away like shadows. In each raid, his legend grew, and with it, his enemies' fear. Yet England held more than just treasure. It held the thread of Ragnar's fate. For in this land, he would one day meet the cruel destiny foretold in dreams and prophecies. Serpents, betrayal, and death awaited him here. And though he did not yet know the hour, Ragnar sensed it drawing near. Still, he pressed on. He was not a man to shrink from fate. To Ragnar, every raid, every battle, every triumph was a step upon the path the Norns had woven. If his thread was to be cut in England, then he would walk boldly to meet it, axe in hand, name on the lips of men, fear in the hearts of kings. Chapter 10: Betrayal and Capture. Fame is a gift, but it is also a burden. For Ragnar, the very greatness that lifted him above other men also cast long shadows. Rivals envied him, allies doubted him, and even fate itself seemed to watch closely, weaving threads of downfall into the tapestry of his life. It was in England, the land that had long tasted both his sword and his cunning, that the final trap was set. Ragnar, older now, carried the scars of countless battles. His hair was streaked with gray, and though his spirit still burned bright, the weight of years pressed upon him. Some say he returned to England against the counsel of his kin, driven not by need of treasure, but by the hunger for one last great adventure. Others claim he sought to test his sons, to leave them a legacy not of words, but of challenge. Whatever the reason, Ragnar sailed once more across the sea, his fleet smaller than before, his men fewer, but no less loyal. They landed upon English soil with the confidence of wolves who had hunted these fields before. Yet the English, learning from past raids, were prepared. King Ella of Northumbria, fierce and unyielding, set his snares well. His armies lay in wait, his scouts watched the coasts, and when Ragnar's men pressed inland, they found themselves surrounded. Battle erupted, steel against steel, shouts and cries echoing across the countryside. Ragnar fought as he always had, bravely, cunningly, with the strength of a man who had nothing left to prove. But numbers told their tale, and one by one his warriors fell, until only Ragnar remained, taken alive. Bound in chains, dragged before King Ella, the once proud raider stood unbowed. Though mud stained his boots and iron bit into his wrists, his eyes burned with the same fire that had lit his youth. He faced his captor without fear, for he knew the hour of his fate had come. The people gathered to see him, this Northman who had haunted their shores like a storm. Some jeered, some stared in awe, and some whispered that it was dangerous to hold such a man captive, for his legend was greater than his body. But Ella, hungry for vengeance, would not be swayed. He saw not a legend, but an enemy, a wolf who had preyed too long upon his flock. Thus was Ragnar Lothbrok betrayed, not by cowardice nor by weakness, but by the inevitability of time and the net of fate closing around him. The boy from the fjords, the raider of Paris, the scourge of England, now stood in chains, awaiting a death as cruel as the sagas foretold.
Chapter 11. The Pit of Serpents. No ordinary death would satisfy King Ella. To slay Ragnar by sword or spear would grant him too much honor. Instead, Ella prepared a fate steeped in cruelty and spectacle, one that would linger in the memory of men: the Pit of Serpents. In the heart of Northumbria, a great pit was dug, its depths filled with writhing snakes, vipers, adders, and serpents gathered from the wild. Their bodies coiled and twisted, their tongues flickered, their fangs glistened with venom. The pit seemed less a place of execution and more a vision from the darkest of dreams. Before the gathered crowd, Ragnar was brought to the edge. Chains clinked as he stood, yet his posture was tall, his gaze steady. He looked upon the pit not with terror, but with the calm of a man who had long known his fate. The sagas tell us that as he was cast into the pit, Ragnar did not cry out. Instead, he laughed. The serpents struck, their fangs piercing his flesh, venom coursing through his veins. Yet still he laughed, his voice rising above the hissing of snakes and the murmurs of the crowd. And then he spoke words that would echo through history. How the little piglets would grunt if they knew how the old boar suffers. It was no plea for mercy, no lament of pain. It was a message, a prophecy, that his sons, the little piglets, would come to avenge him. His death, cruel as it was, would not end his story. It would ignite the wrath of his bloodline, a storm greater than any raid he had ever led. The venom spread, his body weakening, yet Ragnar's spirit did not falter. Some say he sang of Odin, of Valhalla, of the feast awaiting him in the hall of the slain. Others say his laughter lingered even as life fled from him, a final defiance against those who sought to break him. At last, Ragnar Lothbrok fell silent, his body still among the serpents, but his legend rising higher than ever before. For though the man had died, the story had only grown. And in the years to come, his sons would ensure that King Ella and all of England would remember the name of Ragnar Lothbrok with dread. Chapter 12. The Vengeance of the Sons. The death of Ragnar Lothbrok did not silence his story, it ignited it. For when news of his fate reached the north, carried by whispers and wandering merchants, it set aflame the hearts of his sons. The words he had spoken in the serpent pit, how the little piglets would grunt if they knew how the old boar suffers, were remembered. And grunt they did, with fury that shook kingdoms. Ivar the Boneless, Bjorn Ironside, Hitsirk,
and Sigurd's snake in the eye gathered together, their grief woven into a single purpose: vengeance. They spoke not of mere raids, not of gold or plunder, but of war. A war so vast, so merciless, that it would be remembered as the Great Heathen Army. Ships darkened the seas as never before. Longships by the hundreds sailed from the fjords and rivers of Scandinavia, carrying warriors eager to avenge their fallen lord. Ravens flew overhead as though guiding them, black wings against gray skies, omens of the storm to come. When the sons of Ragnar landed upon the shores of England, the land trembled. No longer were they raiders slipping ashore under cover of night. They came as an army, vast and unrelenting, their banners flying, their horns sounding, their axes thirsting for blood. The kingdoms of England, so often divided, now faced a single, united force of North wrath. King Ella of Northumbria, the man who had cast Ragnar into the pit of serpents, stood at the center of their fury. His men gathered, his defenses raised, but against the great heathen army, his strength was as straw before fire. The sons of Ragnar descended upon him with vengeance in their hearts and the memory of their father burning in their veins. The battle was swift, brutal, and final. Ella was captured, just as Ragnar had been, and the sons showed him no mercy. The sagas tell of a punishment as cruel as his own deeds: the blood eagle. His ribs were broken open, his lungs pulled from his chest, his body laid bare to the skies. Whether truth or legend, the tale served its purpose. Ella's death became a symbol of vengeance fulfilled, a warning to all who would mock the blood of Ragnar Lothbrok. But the sons did not stop with Ella. Their wrath rolled across England, seizing kingdoms, toppling thrones. Ivar's mind guided their armies with ruthless precision. Bjorn's strength carved paths through enemy lines, and the others fought with the fury of men who carried both their father's name and his unfinished destiny. Villages burned, kings fell, and the land itself seemed to shudder beneath the weight of their campaign. For years, the great heathen army ravaged England, reshaping its history. Some sons returned to the north with their spoils, while others carved realms for themselves in foreign soil. Bjorn sailed south to lands beyond the Mediterranean, forging his own legend. Ivar remained in England, feared as much for his cunning as for his cruelty. Sigurd and Hitserk sought their own paths, carrying the family name like a torch into distant horizons. And through it all, Ragnar's prophecy proved true. His death had not ended him, it had multiplied him. Each son carried forward a fragment of his spirit. Ivar his cunning, Bjorn his strength, Sigurd his pride, Hitserk his fire. Together they ensured that the name of Ragnar Lothbrok would never fade. In the north, skalds sang of him by firelight, their voices weaving sagas that would echo for centuries. In Francia and England, his name lingered like a wound that would not heal. Even in lands far beyond his reach, stories spread of the Viking who laughed in the face of death, who met serpents with defiance, who left behind sons that shook kingdoms. And so Ragnar Lothbrok passed from man into myth, Perhaps he was real. Perhaps he was many men whose deeds became one legend. Perhaps his sagas grew larger than truth, shaped by the hands of poets and the imaginations of dreamers. But in the end, it matters little. For whether flesh or fable, Ragnar Lothbrok became eternal. His story is told not just as history, but as a lullaby of the North, of fjords and fire, of love and loss, of destiny faced unflinching. The boy who once stared across the sea, dreaming of horizons unseen, became a legend carried by waves and winds. And somewhere in the great hall of Valhalla, where warriors feast and laughter shakes the rafters, one can imagine Ragnar Lothbrok seated among the honored dead, a horn of mead in hand, a smile upon his lips, and the laughter of a man who lived as fiercely as any could dream. For though his thread was cut, the fire of his name burns on forever.